So we're going to continue our theme of the resilient entrepreneur. And again, if you haven't picked up the run of show in the front, please do. We're now going to talk a bit about how curiosity and calm build resiliency. And I can't think of two better books to help us think more about this topic than Laura Huang's great book, you already know, and Chris Berdik's book, Clamor, which I had to read in one setting. Thanks for ruining it. Actually, helping me enjoy a Saturday, Chris. Just terrific books. So Laura is a professor of management and organizational dynamics. She's at Northeastern now. She's been at HBS, Wharton, and she's an electrical engineer by training. You can tell this book is precise, organized, and adds lots of great suggestions at the end. So I'm grateful for that. That alone is worth the price of this book. Just to think through. You always pick up a book and you think through what can I do with this. Laura tells you. Chris is a former staff editor at The Atlantic and he's research editor at Mother Jones. He's a freelancer, but he's written for The Times, Wired, Popular Science, Politico. He's gotten all kinds of grants. His first book was Mind Over Mind: The Surprising Power of Expectations, and explored the placebo effect in medical and non-medical contexts. It is on my stack at home because I don't have enough to read. So my thinking is that both of these books explore the power of subtle, often overlooked forces that shape our experience and how we make decisions and how we perceive things. And so, Laura, I'll start with you. You deal with lots of MBA students who are going to be entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are busy and they have to make consequential decisions quickly. And you tell them they need to slow down, take a deep breath, ideally in a quiet space. But Laura, if I'm that hard-charging entrepreneur, and there are a number of them in the audience, I don't have time to do that. Why do I need to step back?
Yeah, so great question. And I should preface this by saying whenever someone introduces me as an electrical engineer, I never know if that's a compliment.
Always a compliment.
Or an insult. But yeah, I think in terms of entrepreneurs and the fast pace of things, right? I think, the fact that I have this engineering degree is something that, we deal with data all the time. Entrepreneurs deal with data. They deal with analytics. They deal with, in today's age, AI, all sorts of things. And the slowing down piece is what I really wanted to study. And, it was a very crazy thing where people said, you're an electrical engineer that wants to study gut feel, right? That doesn't make any sense at all. And what I really wanted to do was quantify something that is seemingly very unquantifiable, quantify gut feel, so that we could and really define what it is, because we cannot hone it, harness it, train it even for ourselves unless we truly understand what it is. So I would say that slowing down piece means not necessarily that you're slowing down and not making the decision. In fact, you are taking action. But what you're recognizing is that you're combining data, personal experiences, your expertise, your patterns, even your trauma, all sorts of background that you have. And that's happening all of the time. And when you slow down and allow that data to combine with your personal experiences and your patterns and your mental models and your schemas, that's when amazing things happen. That's when you have those flashes of clarity. And so one kind of misunderstanding about gut feel is that it's the opposite of data. It actually isn't. It integrates data. And when it integrates data in a process, it results in a flash of clarity, which is your gut feel. So that's where that slowing down really,
our entrepreneurs will
really,
see themselves in this book.
Absolutely.
That's the hope.
Hope so.
Chris, I took from your book. In fact, after I read it, talking with an entrepreneur, said, "Tell me about Clamor," and I said, "I think Chris's message is sort of don't just do something, stand there," because we're so attuned to constant action, and you're telling us in very specific scientific ways. Hold on. Can you talk a little bit about that? Speak to the entrepreneurs in the room who say, Chris, you got to make decisions. You got to think about a lot of data at the same time, and you have to move."
Right. So one thing you realize when you write anything about noise, the first thing you encounter is how we understand it through our laws and basically through the science. And typically it's always measured in decibels, which is basically a very thin slice of what noise is. It's loudness. I think a different definition that I found really helpful was not just unwanted sound, but unwanted signals. Some of these signals are very loud, some of them are less loud, and some of them are silent. They make no noise at all. And I think we have some assumptions when it comes to noise, which is it's dynamic, there's collaboration, there's progress, it's fun. And we have some assumptions about quiet, which is it's an absence. There's nothing happening. And I think in business, you probably would prefer the former. And I think there is a misunderstanding of what noise actually does when it comes to collaboration, which it sometimes kills collaboration. It sometimes makes people, like Harvard business professors studied this when businesses went from regular offices to open offices. People stopped meeting face to face. They just put their headphones on and texted one another or emailed one another. Schools that get too much noise in them, the kids have lower reading scores. So progress does not follow noise there either. And even fun, when you're in a restaurant and you can't actually talk to people next to you because you can't hear them, you get lower stars in those restaurants. That's another study that I've looked at. So all these things, it's not that one particular soundscape is better than another, but it's the assumptions that we have about noise. And when we think about quiet, it's not just absence. I think about it as a space of uncluttered attention. And so that's kind of how I would phrase it.
I liked the book so much because it really did, Laura's too, give you the appreciation that there's so much that goes into resilience, health, wellness, making these decisions, and that how we think about things matters. So things like, for example, when you're driving and you're trying to figure out whether it's this street or this street, you turn the radio down. And can you talk a little bit about why you do that in terms of making a decision of left or right, and how do we process noise in that kind of circumstance?
Well, we're bombarded with stimuli, sensory stimuli. Everything that we hear, we have to make sense of by essentially deciding what's important and what's worthwhile, and then joining it into a particular signal. And that signal can be visual, it can be auditory, it can be simply cognitive. And the similar gating is going on in your brain, no matter what the modality of that signal is. So if you have too much auditory coming in from...
Like that?
Yes. From a radio, and then that will interfere with your ability to kind of figure out the signal of like, oh, I'm supposed to turn left here, not right here, or anything like that.
Laura, directionally, look, I've been here before. I'm just going to make this decision. There's a pattern to it. How is gut feel not that?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Chris was saying, right? In what I find in my research is that what we don't do enough of is listening to what whispers instead of what screams, right? So there's so much that's out there that's screaming at us, right? Physically loud things like, laundry machines, dishwashers, but also algorithms, right? We don't even get to pick the next YouTube video that we want to watch without it predicting what we want to watch next, or our next Netflix, or whatever it may be, right? So there's two ways that the whispers can actually amplify, right? We can either quiet the noise, or we can actually make the whisper louder to ourselves, right? And so we can make the whisper louder to ourselves by recognizing our own personal, the way that gut feel manifests for ourselves, right? And so what I find is that, through dozens of studies, what I find is that gut feel, there are three universal ways that we have a gut feel. And that kind of relates to when we're turning off the route. How do we know that so we have either a eureka moment, right? Which is that kind of aha moment. We've been struggling with a problem for weeks, and then all of a sudden we're in the shower and we're like, that's the solution. We also have spidey sense, right? Which is you're in this dark alley, I really shouldn't be here. Or even, I'm hiring this person and they look great on paper, right? But why do I feel like I don't want to hire them? And then the third is what's called a jolt, right? And something, a signal or a cue or something happens and it jolts us. It literally changes the fundamental way that we've perceived it before. It might be something we've believed for decades, and now we see it in a completely different light. So universally, we share these types of gut feel, but individually, we experience them very differently. There are different ways that we all have. So for your eureka moment, for example, might be that you start to get a little bit nervous and you have this nervous energy, right? For Chris, his eureka moment might be that he starts to feel really excited, right? So yours might be nervousness, his might be excited. You might feel it physically differently. So you might feel like your hands start to tingle. He might start feeling something in his gut, literally in his gut. So when we can recognize our own kind of signals cognitively, emotionally, mentally, all sorts of different signals that we have, that's when we know, hey, am I making the right choice here, or am I not making the right choice? And I think also what happens is that we sometimes think that, we misinterpret. So for example, we often misinterpret emotions, thinking that it's gut feel. So we might feel a sense of urgency and think, this is my gut feel telling me that I need to do something. But in fact, I always talk about it like, yeah,
do this.
Right, exactly. We do things, and then later on we realize it was the wrong choice. And I always think of emotions like children, right? Like emotions are like children. You don't want them driving your car, right? But you also, because you might crash, but you also don't shove them in the trunk, right? Because they would die, right? So you want them in the back seat where they can be seen and heard and attended to. And it's a very similar thing. Emotions are a part of your gut feel, but you don't want them sort of driving the car, or you don't want to kind of suppress them entirely either.
I love that description. When I was thinking about these books for CEOs and for the folks that we counsel, I think that both of these, if you're going to do a corporate retreat, you should buy both of these and have people read them. So, Chris, assuming that people do this, one of the first questions for a corporate retreat is, how can we tune out the noise on a day-to-day basis so that we can make better decisions?
Sure. And I'll just preface this by saying that my children are now driving a car. They've just turned 16.
Top of mind.
And yes, it's very top of mind.
All right.
I think I have it easy because I work for myself, but I can set these ground rules that, for instance, I silence my phone for long stretches of the day. And if I know that I'm going to get a call, a very important call, I'll definitely not silence it. I'll be there for it. And I get yelled at occasionally by my wife or my kids that I'm not, picking up. But they know that I keep my phone on silent because I need to do that to focus on the writing that I do. And they know that they need to reach me by email or, some other way. So, setting that kind of a ground rule, I think, is a very useful thing to be able to. I read a book while I was doing my research on mine called Silence by a Zen Buddhist named Thich Nhat Hanh. And he talked about, you may not be a meditator, but you can do what's called a walking meditation. And that's just doing whatever you're doing. You're going for a walk, you're doing the dishes, you're brushing your teeth, and just doing that and doing it mindfully. And so I think that's an important thing. Multitasking has its place, but also having these quiet moments, which I don't think we have enough of, and that's very important.
I love that. Laura, for that leader who's going to pass this out for the retreat, I want people to get the book, so I don't want to tell them too much. Laura, what should they be thinking about to taking a deep breath? What are the kind of things that leaders can do to tune out the noise and start to think about themselves and knowing themselves and how they make decisions?
Yeah, I think especially for leaders, and I'm also, what Chris was sort of saying about mindfulness. I think one of the things with leaders is that we sometimes struggle with, how do we know that our gut feel is actually leading us to the right decision? How do we know if we think it's our gut and it ends up being wrong, right? And it's also tricky because we don't often have the counterfactual, right? We don't know what would have happened if we had if we had gone in the other direction. And so I think these are all sort of things that I really wanted to dig into when I was doing this research, right? How do I actually measure that counterfactual? How do we test that when, because my whole premise is that you can hone and harness and train your gut feel, that it's like a muscle, that you can actually train it so that you can make better decisions and decisions that you can trust. And the other premise that I make, which is that your gut feel never lies. It never lies to you, right? So that's a pretty big kind of thing. It never lies to you. And so kind of connecting this to both the leaders and the mindfulness, it really reminds me of the fact that where leaders sometimes struggle the most is not situational awareness, which has been their superpower for a really long time. The fact that they have these patterns, they have the expertise, and they have a situational awareness where they're able to see and take their prior experience and apply it to something else. And so they're so good at that because they have the experience and the expertise. So in many ways, what leaders need to do to train their gut feel is to be just as aware of those patterns and the situational awareness as they are with their situational arrogance. Okay, and situational arrogance means that sometimes you're so successful that you go into a new situation and you don't notice that there's a key variable that has shifted. And if you change one variable, the entire equation now needs to be rebalanced or needs to be shifted. And the more that you can recognize that key variable that has shifted, right? Like, hey, we're no longer in this opportunity setting, right? Now we just need to stop the bleeding, or now the industry has shifted in this one key way, or just understanding that variable. And so I'll give you a very quick example, because the book I have, 2/3 of the book is filled with kind of exercises, questions, ways that you can actually be training yourself. But that mindfulness piece, it kind of relates to that, which is, Chris talked about being very, very mindful in things that you're doing, right? You said like walking and brushing your teeth and things like that. And it made me think like the key to being aware of your situational arrogance, when you start to see, what you're trying to do is expand your mental models, your schemas. You're trying to be an expert and understand your expertise, but still be able to see the perspective of the novice, right? So you want to maintain that expertise while still seeing that kind of beginner, that novice kind of perspective. So let's say, for example, you're brushing your teeth, right? And you're all experts at brushing your teeth. You're experts in a lot of things, but you're experts at brushing your teeth. And let's say you're right-handed. So every night you brush your teeth with your right hand. But if, for example, I said, tonight you're gonna brush your teeth with your left hand. You're gonna try brushing your teeth with your left hand. And all of a sudden, you're still an expert at brushing your teeth, but you brush your teeth with your left hand and you start noticing things, right? You start noticing, hey, wow, well, this part of my mouth actually kind of hurts, and I usually ignore this part of my mouth. I don't brush as deeply here. I should probably make an appointment at the dentist to get this like pain checked. You start to expand your purview. And this is a very simplistic example. I talk about how you can do this with, expertise in your jobs and your function and your roles. But this sort of illustrates how you're still an expert, but you start to embed that novice perspective, that unfamiliar, sort of that awkward perspective, and you see things that you wouldn't have necessarily seen. And if you do the equivalent, right, I abstract it to many different levels of how you can do this, you're still mindful, but you're tapping into your intuition in a very different way, and it allows you to now truly be that expert that can rely on your gut feel in a much more trusted way.
Such great advice. And Chris, you also talk a little bit about this. So give, and I don't want to give too much away, but give some tips for that CEO, that entrepreneur who's so busy, has to have some noise all the time in the car, have to have loud music, have to do this. If I'm working, I have to have music in the background. And you tell them maybe you ought to be thinking about this in a different way.
Right. So there was a researcher in Finland named Valtteri Hangisto, and he was asked by the Finnish government essentially to look into this noisy office problem that they were having that they couldn't figure out how to deal with, because what they were trying to do, and in Finland they love quiet. It's part of how they market their country to people to come and enjoy the tundra and the quiet forests. So they are into quiet. And so their solution to a noisy office was to add more sound absorption, to make sure that the HVAC systems were as quiet as possible. And what this ended up doing was backfiring, because the noise in an office that is the most troublesome and distracting is the noise that you can understand. It's the chatter of your office mates. It's your colleagues on
You can tune some of it out, but you need it.
You need it, but the way to tune it out is when it's unintelligible. So, for instance, when they've done research on half-a-logs, which is like a half of a phone conversation, if the half-a-log is in a language you don't understand, it's not a problem to you. If they distort that half-a-log so that it's garbled, you can't understand it, again, it's not distracting to you. And so he was looking at, at what point does quiet just on its own backfire? And he started to add distortion. And what he found was that at a certain level, people do just as well with sound. The decibel didn't matter as much when it was unintelligible as they did in quiet. He was doing these cognitive tasks. So I think there's a very real thing when you need some sound, some noise, some background as a means of helping you focus. It's a masking of the signals that would otherwise distract your mind.
I want to go back to a point you made about distraction for both of you. And Chris, you started to talk a little bit about this, working remotely. How does working remotely impact how you think about noise in the environment? And Laura, how does working remotely impact your ability to pick up the important signals that you need to hone your intuition? So questions broadly, social media, a little bit of advice, Chris, for leaders about what they ought to do if they're working remotely. And Laura, same thing.
Want me to take it first?
Yeah, you take it first. Yeah.
So I actually don't think it impedes your ability. I think it just has to be in the right form, right? There's different contexts, right? There's certain businesses that can thrive with a remote workforce. There's certain businesses that we try.
Touch matters.
But it actually really matters. And I think we try to sometimes apply a one-fits-all solution to, there's this. Now, culturally, we all want to work from home. But for some businesses, the reality of it is that it just does not work. You have to be in person. Even if the work can be done remotely, you lose all sorts of the tacit, the intuitive. You lose all of that when you do not have people together sort of struggling over the same things. And so, it's not so much about is impeding or not. It's just everyone has a different.
It's different.
Okay. Yeah, and even if people's gut feel will be different, right? If we could face the exact same problem or the exact same dilemma. Should we, quit our job in Boston and move to Denver, right? And you might have one gut feel, and I might have a completely different gut feel, but it will be completely accurate for us because, a lot of times, even, in my research, I find that the first question people ask is, what is gut feel? Right? And I define it. I do say, what is gut feel? But the actual best question is not what is gut feel. It's who is gut feel.
Right.
Because gut feel is you. It is based on your personal experiences. And if you're slicing and dicing the data in one way and someone else is slicing and dicing the data in another way, right? That is what really matters. That is what's leading you to that 100% accurate decision.
Love it. Chris, so really that kind of follow-up, You talked about how you put your phone on silent. People working remotely, we have students in the audience as well. Without giving away too much, what kind of things should they be thinking about in terms of how noise impacts their ability to be productive?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Laura was saying, that there's not one single recipe for the proper work environment. And a lot of the return to the office battles are pitting this idea that there is. That when you're in the office, that allows for people to connect and collaborate and have that kind of team ethos that you lose when you're at home. And when people are talking about, well, I'd rather work at home, it's because they can focus, they can control their own space. And what I think we should focus on is understanding that a work environment should have both of those types of spaces. That you should be able to, the sound in your environment is not just some background. It is actually part of the functioning of a space. So if you are having a work environment that you want people to collaborate in, then you should have a place where
where that can happen.
Right. And if you have, but you should also have a place where they can do focused work, because that is going to be part of their day. And if they can't do their focused work there, then the value of being in the collaborative spaces decreases, and they will avoid it.
So as a book event, of course, people are always asking before we get to a couple of questions, what are you reading? What are you reading these days?
Well, I just finished one book, and I have usually one book that's a hardcover and one on Kindle. And the book that I just finished on hardcover was Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green.
Oh, it's a great book.
Which is a fantastic book. Yeah. And I just picked up a book called The Feather Detective, which is about the first forensic ornithologist who solved crimes by looking at the feathers. Or
wow!
I've just started it, but it's reading like a thriller. It's by Chris Sweeney, and so I'd highly recommend that one.
So maybe another book after this. Okay, I won't ask you both the unfair question of not only what are you reading, but what are you going to write about next, because I'm sure that depends, right? Laura, what are you reading?
Yeah, I think in terms of the reading and the writing, so I actually only read. I would say 95% of what I read is all fiction, even though I write nonfiction.
Let's hear it.
So I also, like Chris, I have piles of books that are on the to read list. I also sometimes am reading multiple books at the same time. And I've gotten into this habit now where I used to just sort of struggle my way through a book because I could not read the whole thing. But now if it's not good after 50, 30, 40, 50 pages, right? I just chuck it and then I move on. So right now I'm in my stage of where I'm rereading a lot of the classical literature that I read when I was in high school.
That's very
Because
cool.
what I found was that when you reread things that you once read, you have a completely different perspective on it. Books that you loved, books that you didn't love. So I'm reading Waiting for Godot. By Samuel Beckett.
Okay.
And I have a completely different perspective on it now than I did in high school, where I was trying, so I find that's great. Take those books that you loved or didn't love and reread them. I find I get more from books I'm rereading now than new books. And I don't know, no commentary on, the quality of writing back then versus now, but yeah.
I love those. I love those recommendations, particularly because we have a number of Boston College high school students here. Welcome to all of you, and we want to make you all readers. So
and you're saying, "Oh my gosh, I would never read the books that I'm reading."
Why would I read that?
Scarlet Letter, never again.
Right. So we have time for one or two questions from our audience. Right here, Jim.
I have a question about my gut feel. You mentioned that I love the gut feel integrates data. What are your suggestions for feeding data to your gut feel?
Yeah. Okay. So,
you repeat the question a little.
Oh yeah. Sorry. The question was, you mentioned that. Well, first he complimented me, so that was very nice.
Buy the book.
Yes, he complimented me and said he loved everything I said, which was very nice. And then he said, you mentioned that data is a part of gut feel. So, what suggestions do you have for integrating and bringing in more data into your life? So I have multiple answers to that. I'll kind of keep it short. I mean, I think the first
they're in the book.
Yeah, well, some of them are, but some of them are like secret just for you. But okay. All right. So, some of it is that the number one thing is that, first of all, we have, mood lighting. Okay. So the first thing is that we don't typically have a problem with data being available to us. What we have a problem with is how we bring in the data and how we choose what type of data to integrate. And so one of the big distinctions that I make, that I study in my research, is that what holds us back sometimes from doing exactly that is that we don't understand, we have this lay view of what gut feel is. We all sort of have a definition. For some people, it's like this magical, mystical thing where you can tell the difference between a fake Van Gogh and a real Van Gogh, right? All the way down to the people who are sort of like, oh, it's a, we have to be careful because our gut feel might be biased, and so we need to gather more data to support and not lead us in the wrong directions. But the actual part of this that I found that was it was that intuition and gut feel are two very different things. Okay, they are not the same thing. We use them interchangeably, right? And so there is what's called an intuiting process. Okay, we have an intuiting process that then culminates in a gut feel outcome. And during that intuiting process, that's when we are bringing in the data. We're combining that data with our personal experiences, and all of that combines into almost an executive summary that gives us that flash of clarity, that gives us that gut feel outcome. Is this working? Okay. And the problem, though, is that sometimes that intuiting process is very long, right? It can be 2 years, it can be 2 weeks, it could be 20 years, but sometimes it's very short. It's 2 seconds long. And so it almost seems like it overlaps with that outcome. And so the more that we can understand that there's a process and understand that during the process there are, again, I go into all sorts of I go into Bayesian statistics and talk about priors and prompts and all sorts of things, that those priors are based on our personal experiences, those prompts are based on the data, and collecting the right type of data that intertwines and allows us to have that executive summary. So
and some great checklists in the book as well.
Exactly. So hopefully that was a satisfying enough answer, but I talk a lot about those priors and the prompts and the data piece and how you can integrate that.
Such a practical book. I highly recommend it. Other questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank Chris and Laura so much. The books are Clamor, and you already know.